Welcome, and I'm continuing the tour of Tate Britain, and we continue the tour with the Late Victorians. And remember last week I didn't complete some of the paintings in the 1840 room. In fact, I'd like to apologise that I went over by 15 minutes. This week I'm picking up where I left off last week. We'll complete the pictures at the 1840 room. They're mostly 1880, 1890, so the end of the Victorian period. Then I'll move through into the small room next door, which is 1890 to 1900, and go round that room. And so that's the today's session. And as normal, I'd like to begin the session not with the paintings in the room, but with a little bit of background just to set the context of the couple of decades that we're talking about this week. And the first one is just to point out that during the Victorian period from 1837 to 1901, there were very few major international conflicts in which Britain was involved. The major one, of course, was the Crimean War. But towards the end of this period, 1899, was the Boer War. And this painting by he's normally called Byam Shaw, by Byam Shaw, is called the Boer War. And I wanted to point out a couple of things about it. First of all, the war and the way people thought about that and the effect that that had on society. But also you'll notice this picture is in a certain style, and it might remind you of a picture I showed you a couple of weeks ago, Ophelia. The river, which in fact here it is the Thames, the woman, and the extreme detail in which the grass, the flowers, the trees are represented. It's the Pre-Raphaelite style we're seeing here, 50 years after the Pre-Raphaelites. Now, when the Pre-Raphaelites Brotherhood formed, they were controversial and criticised in the newspapers. But by this stage, they'd gone through the period when they'd become accepted and then extolled and so on. And by this period, they seemed to be a bit old-fashioned, but not in a negative sense, but in a respected sense. They'd become part of the establishment, if you like. And Byam Shaw is who was a friend of John Everett Millais, and in fact it was Millais who encouraged him to go to art school. And he's painting in this style to I think create this mood of nostalgia for times gone by, the old Pre-Raphaelite style, the detailed representation of nature. And the woman is dressed in mourning, the black skirt. She's holding a skein of purple wool. In the distance, let me point to it. Up here above the trees, there's two birds. Over here, there's two butterflies. And then down here in the river, there's a single feather, which is significant. Oh, and also notice that on her left hand, she doesn't have a ring, but she has a ring on her right hand. Okay, so putting all that together, and we also need to know that the painting was subtitled with a line or two lines from Christina Rossetti's poem, A Bird's Song. And the lines are, "Last summer, green things were greener, brambles fewer, the blue sky bluer." So we are to, and it's called the Boer War, so we're to assume that she's mourning the death of a loved one. As she has a ring on her right hand, not on her left, we might assume that it's not that it's her fiancé or her lover, rather than her brother or father. And that's indicated by the two butterflies and the two birds. The death is indicated by, it's a bit hard to see, but this here that I'm pointing to is a black crow symbolizing death. And the swan's feather, well, swans mate for life. So the feather it says it's the death of a relationship that would have lasted for life. She's stoical. She's was seen by critics as an English heroine mourning her dead fiance or lover. It actually was modelled by I'm sure, sister who was mourning the death of her cousin who was killed in the Boer War. I've mentioned the Boer War. Oh, and the other thing to mention about the Boer War is that although in a sense we won the war, it was marked by a number of defeats. And so it was seen by a lot of people to represent a failure of the British Empire. We were failing in South Africa. And let me move on, because that leads into the major art movement of the late 1880s and 1890s, the end of the century. And I'll come back to the fin de siècle, but in Britain, it was that there was a term used, a decadent art. Now, decadent art, don't get it confused with degenerate art. Degenerate art was a term used by the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s to describe modern art that they didn't like. It was degenerate, and the term degenerate was first used in a book, or in fact it was the title of a book by Max Nordau, a German critic and author, called Entardung, which is the German for decadent, or sorry, degenerate. And he argued that the degeneracy of society started with the beginnings of modern art, which he equated with the Pre-Raphaelites. He thought that their overall detail represented a failure of their brains to focus on anything. And he saw it literally, he describes it as a mental illness that spread across society, starting from art and moving outwards. And then the Nazis reinterpreted what he was writing and added art should be racially pure, represent heroism, and so on. So coming back to decadent art, which is a different thing, is the term decadent was goes back into the 18th century, but at the end of the 19th century, it was a term used to describe a number of artists, like, as we see here, Aubrey Beardsley and Oscar Wilde. It was linked to art for art's sake. It was as if art for art's sake, which was art, early on, it was art just representing beauty and not trying to change society, not making a moral point. But it became very inward looking, and that art for art's sake, it was just art, and it was taken further and further as the world in the end of the century became more skeptical. There was a delight, a self-disgust, a delight in perversion, crude humor, and so on, all became part of this decadent art, which was taken on board by artists proudly. I mean, it has been, there may have been another layer to it, because it has been described as the worship of beauty, like art for art's sake, the worship of beauty disguised as the worship of evil. And we see here, there's a link to art for art's sake. We see here Oscar Wilde is represented by Aubrey Beardsley with the Bible, French dictionaries. This is a first course in French, this book. His novel, Dorian Gray, typical work of decadent art. But he's reading Théophile Gautier, and it was Gautier who first used the term art for art's sake as a, he wasn't the first to use it, but he was the first to use it as a slogan. So there is a link back there to the art movement of a few years previously, but it had evolved into this form of art. And I give you one example, which you're familiar with the two, Beardsley and Oscar Wilde, linked together because Oscar Wilde's play, Salome, was illustrated by Beardsley. And here we see one of the illustrations. And I just wanted to point out the connection with art for art's sake, in particular, although I didn't show it to you, Whistler's The Painted Room, and which he decorated with peacocks. And you see peacocks up here, peacock feathers up here. Remember, this is a symbol of the art for art's sake, the aesthetic movement, and peacock feathers and representations of peacocks down here. So you can see how this art evolved from the arts for art's sake movement. But let's move on to the gallery itself. As I said, we're going to the end of the 1840 room to complete what I didn't finish last week, and then into this small 1890 room. And the end of the 1840 room is here, just to bring you back now. I did talk about this Roussel work, The Reading Girl, but somebody asked me a question, what is she reading? Well, I've tried to find out what she's reading, but there's a lot of information about reading with respect to this painting, but none of it mentions what she's reading. That seemed to be not the point. Let me just dive in the deep end here. Some critics at the time argued that she's not really reading because she's just a model and doesn't have the intelligence. So that was one aspect, but others, particularly critics later, saw it a bit differently. They saw it as the woman was, a woman reading is attacking the patriarchal system of Victorian England because, and I'll give you a quote, "The woman who reads acquires a space to which she and no one else has access. And together with this, she develops an independent sense of self-esteem." And so you can see that there is a controversial aspect to this. And then others have suggested that he shows the woman disrobed, maybe because she's so busy reading, she's forgotten she doesn't have clothes on, or it's been suggested that it's showing her, it's reducing her to just an object that the male viewer can look at to demean her, if you like, because of the threat she represents. There's also another interesting painting that isn't in the Tate, but I just, it's often linked with this painting. So I wanted to show it to you because it's, remember Augustus Egg? This is the last painting he completed before he died of asthma in Algiers. And he suffered from asthma all of his life. And he often traveled to the south of France because of the air. And this is the south of France. Outside, I mean, I didn't recognize it, but some of you might recognize it's Menton in the south of France, the French Riviera. These women are traveling. We can see the train is moving because this little tassel here is at an angle, so it's jogging along. And one of the women is reading and the other is asleep. Now, you can either view this as a representation that harks back perhaps to Hogarth's industry and idleness, where one of the people in Hogarth, it was two young men, two boys initially, but one of the people is industrious and improving herself, and the other is idle and asleep. Or it's been suggested that they're both engaged in empowering themselves through, in one case, a dream world, and in other case, a dream world of fiction in which she's immersed. It's not necessarily fiction, of course, but that's one of the interpretations. I'm just giving you various interpretations of these paintings that critics have created over the years. So that has, this painting has been linked to this one. And so the question that was raised about what is she reading last week was actually led to a long train of research on my part, but enough on this painting. And this William Orchardson was a very popular painter. He first exhibited in Scotland. He's a Scottish painter that came down to London, and when he was 30 and started what was called then the Scottish School. And this painting is one of a series of 3 representing the subject of unhappy marriage. It's called The First Cloud. This large space in the floor between them represents the distance between them. They seem to have had an argument. I don't know whether they've been sitting either side of the fireplace and discussing something, and she's just walking out on him. And you can see from his look, he's not very happy. It was exhibited with a line from Tennyson's poem, Merlin and Vivian. And the line is, "It is the little rift within the lute that by and by will make the music mute." So that gives a very clear, together with the title, The First Cloud, a very clear indication of the point that Orchardson's making. And this idea of representing a dramatic moment is something that he was very good at. He was never, I don't know whether you agree with this, but I don't think he's being over theatrical. He could have staged it more. It's restrained, and it was appreciated by critics, this restrained economy of style in representing these dramatic moments. And he was admired by many painters at the time. Degas, Walter Sickert, James Whistler, and so on, were all admirers of his work. And he did a lot of portraits as well. He even painted Queen Victoria, Prince Edward, and so on. He painted royalty. So he was admired by artists, and he was actually compared by some negatively to Whistler, because of this, I don't know whether you can see it here, but the paint is applied very thinly, which is a technique that Whistler used. He became a Royal Academician, he was knighted, he was candidate for president of the Royal Academy, and he became a prosperous, eminently acceptable artist in high society and a keen sportsman, like Millet. Another artist I wanted to talk about, an interesting artist, because he appears to be conventional, but there's always if you look for it, an unusual note in his paintings. This is James Tiso, and this is The Ball on Shipboard. And some people have simply, at the time, saw it as a representation of the royal yacht during Cowes Week in 1873, and this was exhibited in 1874. And some people thought that I think it's this woman here was Queen Alexandra, then Princess of Wales, and that this old gentleman here was Tsar Alexander II, or either him or Lord Londonderry. But it was discussed at length trying to identify the people in the pictures. It was also, so that some people loved it, but it was also disliked by many people. And the best description I can give, or the best indication I can give of that, is a description by John Ruskin, who didn't like any of Tiso's work. He described all of his work as unhappy, mere colour photographs of vulgar society. So that's what Ruskin and others thought. It was, and there may be something in that actually, because it may be Tiso taking off society. He was very closely connected with fashion. People followed his style. And one critic wrote, "At present time in England, Mr. James Tiso and Mr. Georges du Maurier exercised considerable control over the fashions." So it wasn't him following fashions, he also set fashions. And what do you notice? There's a faux pas. There's these two women are wearing the same dress. And in fact, if I enlarge it here, you can see it's not very clear, but it was identified at the time that these two women are wearing the same dress and these two women are wearing the same dress. Now, occasionally, two women would wear the same dress if they were twins or close sisters, and it would be something they would do for amusement. But other than that, dresses were individually made prior to this period, but by the 1870s, or starting in the 1870s, there was this idea of what we call it, off the peg, I suppose we'd call it, of making a number of dresses which were the same, that looked like high society dresses that had been made individually, but they were off the peg, and fashion became increasingly commodified. Repetitions of the same thing. So it has been suggested, and I've marked all the, so obviously there can't be that many twins, I wouldn't have thought. It's been suggested that Tiso is having, you could either say he's having fun, poking fun at society and its increasing commodification, or more seriously, that he's criticizing the commodification of society, and through that, the commodification of women, making them all the same, which women went along with because the women were dressing in the style of high society in order to create their status and position in society in order to attract a man with a view to marriage. So, but on the other hand, with the mass production of fashion starting in the 1870s, you could see this as being an age of shams, one critic called it, which ties in with Ruskin's point about the vulgar society and the commodification of society, increasingly all aspects of society. But who knows? We don't really know. As I said, all we know is that in most Tiso's paintings, there's that little jarring or element of it that doesn't quite fit what appears to be a simplistic representation of high society. Another artist that I found a lot of people like the work of Grimshaw today, and he was liked then. John Atkinson Grimshaw, who later signed his paintings Atkinson Grimshaw, was someone who was admired by, in fact, for example, Whistler said that he thought he'd invented night scenes until he first saw the work of Grimshaw. And critics described the atmosphere as reminiscent of Whistler. But of course, Grimshaw, unlike Whistler, uses a technique you could link back to the Pre-Raphaelites because of the detail, not extreme detail, because he often represented the mists and rainy days and so on. He created this literally atmosphere of in the paintings, but with extreme details in the buildings and the people close to us. And he became well known for this. He painted many paintings of this sort. He got into, people liked them, and he I won't say he mass produced them. So he got into trouble at one point in his life because he what's the word, guaranteed a debt, a large debt for a friend, and the friend couldn't pay off the debt, and so it came on to Grimshaw, who was close to bankruptcy, but his patrons bought a lot of his paintings, and there was a period when in the 1880s, this period, where he really churned them out to pay off the debt. And I think the debt was eventually taken over by one of his patrons. So he put that behind him and became a successful financially successful artist again, but we don't actually know a lot about him. We know he married, we know he had 6 children, but we don't know a lot about his life and his motivations. This painting, I've The Health of the Bride, painted in Newlyn by Stanhope Alexander Forbes. I have spoken about before, but not all of you were there when I was covering this painting, so I won't spend too long on it for those that have seen it, but I'll just in fact, there's a personal note here. What we see is I keep thinking of the word wake, I don't know why, the event after the wedding, where the bride is being toasted by this sailor here, and everyone's picking up their glass ready to toast the bride and bridegroom. It's called The Health of the Bride. But the point I wanted to make is that it was very well received as one of his best paintings. It sold for £600, and in fact he was short of money at the time, and the money that this generated, the £600, enabled him to marry. So there was a link to real life here. By painting the Health of the Bride, he raised enough money from the painting to marry himself, to marry in Newlyn. As I said, it was exhibited at the Royal Academy. It was very well received. I think this is the next painting is Sargent painting Monet. They first met in 1876, but they became good friends about 10 years later. We see his Monet's wife sitting at the edge of the wood. We see Sargent painting outdoors. He was persuaded, that's probably not the right word, encouraged. He saw the joy of working outdoors when he spent more time with Monet, and he painted this sketch of Monet outdoors. This was 1885. Remember Carnation Lily Lily Rose? That was painted the end of this same year, because this is the year that he came back, or he came to London. He spent most of his childhood touring Europe with his parents. Well, I will mention it because that maybe leads an explanation. His parents and he was born in America. He's American, and his father was a well-known eye surgeon, but their 2-year-old daughter died, and Sargent's mother suffered a breakdown, and in order to bring the family together and to, I don't know, distract her, his father took them all to Europe, and they never went back. They traveled around Europe for the whole of Sargent's young life. He never went to school. He was born in Florence. He traveled to Paris, Italy, Germany, Switzerland. He spoke fluent French, German, Italian, and English. And his parents took him to art galleries. So he became very highly literate and highly educated and very cosmopolitan. He saw art, listened to music, read literature in native language all over Europe. And he got accepted by the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he won the silver prize and went on from there. So an unusual background. So when I said he came to London, this is part of his lifestyle, if you like, always traveling. Let's go back into the other room, because I think there were some paintings I hadn't finished in the other room. So let me just go back. How long have I got? Yes, that's okay. These paintings down the end, I'll talk about these 3 paintings before going through into the other room. Saint Eulalia was martyred in 304 AD, and this, remember we seen a John William Waterhouse already, the Lady of Shalott, and this now Saint Eulalia was particularly gruesomely martyred. Her body was, I won't go into detail, but let's just say her body was torn apart. And I needed to mention that, because if you look at this painting, it's not a representation of the way she was martyred. He could have shown her before she was martyred, of course, but he's chosen to show her lying, apparently crucified, lying at the foot of a crucifix here. And you notice there's a lot of doves. Well, when her martyrdom was written up, I think it was about 80 years later, the first account is mentions that as she died, a dove came out of her mouth and flew up to heaven. And you can see this boy here is pointing up to this dove, which is, we can assume, ties in with the story of Saint Eulalia. And her body, of course, looks totally unharmed. It is a bit controversial, and it was at the time, although it's fair to say, but because her breasts are exposed, but it's fair to say that most reviewers and critics at the time, well, let me read one quote. "The conception is full of power and originality. Its whole force is centered in the pathetic dignity of the outstretched figure, so beautiful in its helplessness and pure serenity, so affecting in its forlorn and wintry shroud, so noble in the grace and strength of its presentment." That's one view of the painting, and that was the generally accepted view. It was well received by critics, and for the reasons I've just given, that's the way that most critics saw it. And as I've said before, a nakedness can be shown if it's associated with purity, in a sense, and that's either through classical mythology and the classical reference there, or through a biblical story. Let's go. Well, let me talk about, no, I'll talk about Burne-Jones first. This is the story of King Cophetua and the beggar maid, and this story of the king and the beggar maid is was a legend that was in a book of poetry published in the 18th century, but it was brought up to date by a short poem called The Beggar Maid by Tennyson. So at the time Burne-Jones wrote this, the poem by Tennyson would have been well known, and the story of the beggar maid would have been well known. The story, basically, see if I can remember it, it's a king who doesn't feel sexually attracted to any women, goes about his life, and then one day in the street he sees a beggar maid and instantly falls in love with her. He throws some coins on the ground, and all the beggars come, including her, come rushing forward. And as she comes towards him, he immediately proposes to her. She accepts. She becomes queen, and you might be surprised by this, they live happily ever after to the ends of their life. So the theme is one of love, how love overcomes or supersedes status. So even a king succumbs to love is the story, is what's represented in this picture, the power of love. And that would have been seen, that was seen by all of the critics at the time, and it was heralded, it was named Picture of the Year by the Art Journal. But the Times described it as not only the finest work Mr. Jones has ever painted, but one of the finest pictures ever painted by an Englishman. It then was exhibited in France a few years later, and it was so wildly accepted that he was made Légion d'honneur and a major award in France for his work. And even his wife thought that this painting, she wrote that this painting contained more of Edward's own qualities than any other he painted. There is, I don't know whether to mention it, but there is another angle on this. There's always another angle, isn't there? The face of the beggar girl. Let me put up, I'll do this briefly. This is an enlargement of the beggar girl here. And this is his wife, Georgiana Burne-Jones, painted a few years before, the previous year. And some people have thought there's a similarity, although Burne-Jones does tend to idealize faces in a standard way. But the link to his wife is that Burne-Jones had an affair with Maria Zambacco a few years previously, and he had attempted to leave his wife, which caused a scandal, and it was made worse by Zambacco tried to persuade Burne-Jones to commit suicide with her by jumping into Regent's Canal at Little Venice. He refused and she jumped in, and she didn't die, she was pulled out, but it became public knowledge, and that was why the affair became public knowledge and a major scandal. And he continued to paint Zambacco, use her as a model in his paintings, and it's possibly that here he's using his wife as a model to put that behind him or her. It's also been suggested that this model, this Francis Graham, is a model that he sometimes used and other artists use, that it's her face. So she wasn't a model. Francis Graham was the daughter of one of his patrons, I was going to say they had a relationship. They had a friendship, I think it was. He met her when he was 40 and she was 15. And she always described him as the greatest friend of my grown-up life, is a quote from her. Burne-Jones was doted on her and was distraught when she eventually married. So it could be her as well. I'll leave it up to you to work out whether he was trying to make things right with his wife or representing yet another woman that he was madly in love with. So let's return to the room and finish this room with a painting by George Frederick Watts. I haven't spent, there is another painting by Watts at the end of the room, but I thought I'd choose this one. And I haven't spent a lot of time about Watts, but in some ways it's Watts represented the Victorian age better than most artists. To begin with, he lived and worked the entire Victorian age. He was born in 1817, so Victoria became queen in 1837, so he was 20, and so he'd started painting, and he died in 1904, which was 3 years after Queen Victoria died. So his working life spanned the whole of the Victorian era, and by the end of his life he was described as perhaps the most famous painter in the world, certainly in Britain. He had an unusual upbringing. His younger brothers died when he was young, and his mother died when he was 9, and he was a sickly child, so never attended school. He was taught at home, and he had a talent for drawing, and so he went to the museums. He said the Elgin marbles of what were my teacher, and that's how I learned to draw. And when he went to the Royal Academy School when he was 18, he found he didn't have anything to learn, and he thought the teaching was poor, and he left the school. And he made money originally from portraits, as many artists did. They were the most popular form of painting, and painted middle-class people and some aristocrats. He started to tackle history painting and submitted a work to the Palace of Westminster, burnt down and was being rebuilt, and they were looking for murals to decorate it, and he won the prize of £300, and he used the money to visit Paris and Italy to help with his education. And in Italy, he stayed with Lord Holland in his villa outside Florence. And when he returned, he won another prize of £500, and that established his status. That's really what got him started. He had 2 friends in England, Toby and Sarah Prinsep, who were looking for a house, and there was on the estate of Holland in Holland Park, there was a little Holland house, and because he was friends with Lord Holland, he put the 2 of them together, and the Princeps moved into Little Holland House. Now, I'll finish at this point in the story of What's Life, but I just wanted to reach this point. He moved in with them for 3 days because he was looking for somewhere to stay, and he stayed living in the house with them for 30 years. I assume the house was big enough so that he had an area, well, it was big enough that he had an area of his own, a flat in the house, if you like. And he continued to paint the famous of society for the next 50 years. And in fact, he called the project his Hall of Fame. And he also had this style where he would represent symbolic ideas, in this case, beauty, because this is Psyche, who was a mortal, not a goddess, who was so beautiful that the goddess Venus became jealous of her. This is a well-known story in mythology. And she sent her son Cupid to fire his arrow at Psyche to make her fall in love with a monster. But Cupid fell in love with her and hid himself and visited her at night on condition that she was forbidden to look at him. But I seem to remember, persuaded by her sisters, she one night, curiosity got the better of her. She lit a candle and saw it was god Cupid, and they had to separate, although when she died, Jupiter reunited them in heaven. But the point of the story is that she's a mortal of such beauty that it seduced the gods that he's representing here. And that the point I was making is that many, as well as the portraits, many of the works were symbolic in this sense. They represented ideals. At the by the way, he did, when he was 47, he married the 16-year-old Ellen Terry, but the marriage only lasted a year. The marriage I wanted to mention was later, when he became world famous. He had a number of female followers, and one of them was Mary Fraser Tytler. He was 69 and she was 37, and so she looked up after him up to the time they died. And when he died, he bequeathed his work. I think this one was donated to the Tate, but he bequeathed his work to galleries around the country. But his wife, Mary Tytler, found wording in his will that was unclear, which he questioned legally and won the case, and so retained all of his work. It was going to be distributed around the world to galleries, but she invalidated the will, retained the work, created the Watts Gallery at Compton, which I'm sure many of you have now visited, which contains a large number of his works that he had retained at the time of his death. So let's move on to the next room, this small room in here. We've already seen one of the pictures in the room, but let's go round the room. We've just come through this door here, by the way, and when I go into the room, I always turn to my left and go round the room. So we'll start with this picture by an artist you might not have heard of. It's a Scottish artist, Robert Bruff, who was trained or entered the Royal Academy in Scotland, the Royal Scottish Academy School. And he was a well-known artist well, in fact, he settled in Aberdeen and travelled around Europe. He was influenced, I don't know whether you can tell from this painting, but he was influenced by the Spanish artist Velázquez. And he exhibited this painting at the Royal Academy, where it was very well received, and he was became a well-known Scottish painter, and many of his works were shown at the Academy, although this work is perhaps his best known work. It's he was one of the reasons he isn't well known is that he died when he was 34. He died young sadly in a train accident. He'd been down to London and he was returning to Scotland. The train stopped, I think it was Cudworth station, and the train was hit by an express which overran the signals, and it killed 7 people. He actually was taken in, he wasn't killed immediately, he was taken into hospital. Sargent rushed up to, I should have said he was a friend of Sargent, and in fact he was a pupil of Sargent's. So Sargent, his mentor, rushed up to the hospital and saw him while he was still alive, but he died a couple of days later. And Sargent completed some of his works because he had a female friend, a mistress, who Sargent completed his works and sold them to provide an income for his mistress and child. And this was seen as a testament to his memory and was bequeathed to the Tate. Oh, this one is interesting. This is Alfred Gilbert, who you might know Alfred Gilbert as, and you might recognize this small, you saw how big it was, statuette of what's usually called Eros in Piccadilly Circus. It's the Shaftesbury Memorial Fountain, to give it its proper name. And in fact, it's not Eros. Everyone calls it Eros, but it's Enteros. And there were 2 mythological representations, personifications of love. One is Eros, who is essentially the god of satisfied love, and Enteros, or sexual love might be the best way of putting it. And Enteros is the god of selfless love. In other words, the god of like why we give to charity, if you like. And it was a memorial to Lord Shaftesbury because he was a philanthropist who gave so much to charity. So it's a recognition of his charity work that was erected in Piccadilly Circus. And it was commissioned. Alfred Gilbert got the commission, and he decided, I think he decided that he would not cast it in bronze, but he would use this state-of-the-art modern metal aluminium. Well, aluminium is very difficult to cast, and in fact, it financially ruined Gilbert at the time, who left he became bankrupt, fled the country in 1901, and went to Bruges and lived, I think it was 25 years in Bruges, because he couldn't come back to the country, to England, because of the debtors. And the other thing to say about this small statuette is that we were lucky we have it, because there was, but before he left the country, he went into his studio and smashed all the works in his studio, and then left for Bruges, as I said. But the plaster model, which was found smashed, was repaired by another artist and used to cast a bronze statuette, which was then acquired by the Tate. So this is a bronze cast of what was a plaster model that was one of those that was used to help Alfred Gilbert create the full-size model of Enteros in Piccadilly Circus as a memorial to Lord Shaftesbury. Incidentally, he did eventually return, which is an even stranger story than him fleeing. He received a number of commissions. He still got commissions from England, even though he was in Bruges, including royal commissions. But he got so many commissions that he didn't have time. He took on more commissions than he had time to complete. And so he didn't deliver the result on time. And as a result, a story was written in the press, because there were a number of people that didn't receive the works they'd paid for. And the story in the press described him as a liar and a rogue. And as a result, he was a Royal Academician. I don't know whether he was the only one, he was dishonorably discharged from the Royal Academy. So he was thrown out of the Royal Academy. His wife left him, and she was briefly a patient in a mental hospital, but then she died. He married his housekeeper in Bruges. He went to Rome, and he continued to get commissions, and his fortunes improved. And then in the end, after 25 years, he returned to England, where he was forgiven by George V. And then in due course, he was reinstated as a Royal Academician, and then eventually knighted. And at the time of his death, Alfred Gilbert is probably the best known sculptor in England. And even though he was an atheist, he was given a memorial service in St. Paul's Cathedral. After his death, his reputation went right down, because he was seen to be out of fashion. He was old-fashioned, but he's actually reinterpreted more in the last 20 or 30 years by art historians, and he's now seen to be one of the most original sculptors in Britain at the end of the 19th century. Oh, I was going to just to remind you of the full-size statue of Enteros in Piccadilly Circus, so you could compare it. Just briefly touch upon this artist, Henry Tuke, August Blue. He painted many pictures of boys bathing in Cornwall. This is Falmouth Harbour, and the title, by the way, is from a Swinburne poem called The Sundew, where I can't remember the line, but there's a line in the poem that mentions August Blue. Tuke grew up in Cornwall, and helped found he's one of the founders of the Newlyn School, and he's well known for his portraits or pictures of boats and portraits of people. He often painted or sketched in the open air. He typically exhibited at the Royal Academy, and he was regarded as fresh and modern. He didn't use conventional models, and so his style was seen to be more alive, more active than the lifeless classical models that most artists used. The painting, it was described by one as perhaps the sunniest picture ever painted, and he was again, after his death, which is in 1929, he had a heart attack. His work quickly wasn't fashionable, and he left a lot of money when he died to the boys who had been his models throughout his life. And he's mostly remembered today for paintings of young men. And the number of paintings he painted, let me check, 1,300 works, so a prolific painter. Let me, sorry. Let me go to the right screen, right. Just turning around to the next wall. Let me just double check. Yeah, that wall, round to the next one. This painting we've already covered. This is another well-known artist at the time. He was born in London, of Huguenot descent. This is that's why he's got a French-sounding name, Breton Rivière. Beyond Man's Footsteps. Now he was well known as an animal painter, and he often painted dogs, and he was a regular contributor to the Royal Academy, and he was very interested in Darwin's ideas. I haven't really mentioned Darwin that much, but Darwin's ideas of evolution had a big effect after he published Origin of Species in 1859. So from the 1860s onwards, there was a lot of talk in society. It undermined some people's beliefs, certain religious beliefs, certainly fundamentalist sort of religious beliefs, that the world is only 4,000 years old and so on. But it changed people's relationship to animals on a sort of spectrum, because Darwin has pointed out that we are just like other animals. We've evolved from an animal that was the ancestor, the common ancestor of us and apes. And at the time, so that was one part of the background. The other part is this location, the Arctic, the polar regions. They were seen in a highly aesthetic and also mysterious way. I've got a quote here, that the Arctic is described as that mysterious temple which sits forever on the forehead of the world. In other words, it was a place of wonder, a place to inspire religious awe, a place that was full of danger that human beings had not visited or rarely visited, and often died when they attempted to explore it. So there was that feeling of an unknown world, if you like, the same way we might feel about the moon, because we've traveled there, we've set foot on the moon a number of times, but not very often. And it's this remote, mysterious world. But in this case, it's part of the earth and it has animals there. So this animal is a sort of a representing this harsh, dangerous world where there's always danger. There were a number of, it was a type of painting that a number of artists tackled. There were a lot of paintings of the Arctic often with polar bears. And this is one representation of that dramatic landscape. This is the room we're going into next week. Again, an artist who isn't very well known today, although he did live till he was 73, and he was well known at the time. This is called Parting at Mourning. William Rothenstein, he was a student in Paris at this time, and the painting is inspired, I guess I've got the words, inspired by a poem by Robert Browning, which is, in fact, you can't hardly read it, but down the bottom, well, you can't read it, but down the bottom here are the lines from the poem that I'll read out. And the poem is in 2 parts, and this is the second part. Round the cliff on a sudden came the sea, and the sun looked over the mountain's rim, and straight was a path of gold for him, and the need of a world of men for me. You need to know, which is explained in the first part of the poem, that the world of men for me, a sailor comes in a boat, lands in a cove, walks across the countryside to a remote house where he spends the night with a woman, and then in the morning they maybe I should have explained that first, but then you see that the sun's coming up. Straight was a path of gold for him. I think the him, it is, I thought originally it was her speaking, but the him refers to the sun as it's personified. The sun looked over the mountain's rim, and straight was a path of gold for him, and the need of a world of men for me. So he's leaving her. He's returning back to the boat to go back maybe to his ship, to the world of men. And so this is a representation of the woman that is leaving in the morning. Just on a technical point, he actually painted, well, in fact, he drew it originally and then painted it on paper. But the paper buckled or started, so he actually glued the paper onto thicker paper, and then later he mounted it on canvas. So if you look closely at this, in fact, you can see here some damage here and a crease here. You'll see that it's paper it's actually backed with canvas. And the first sketch he did was charcoal and then painted, and then he used pastels, and then he painted it with this is bronze paint is used for the background. So that's why, if you look at it closely, you'll see splits and tears in the paper. He traveled between, he was a well-known artist and he knew all the other artists. He traveled between London and Paris in the 1890s. He was a friend of Toulouse-Lautrec. He was a friend of Lucien Pizarro. And in fact, he had an exhibition. Toulouse-Lautrec persuaded his dealer to put on an exhibition of Rothenstein's work in Paris, and it was admired by the press and admired by Whistler and Degas. And he became a well-known artist in both countries. He describes it. That's Rothenstein described this woman using a phrase from Henry James, which is, "The wanton was not without a certain cadaverous beauty." And he describes how he came to produce this work using a model that he'd found and used a number of times. You might, I don't know whether it reminds you of Picasso and his blue pit. I mean, obviously it's not blue, but I tried to find a painting by Picasso's blue period that looked close to this, but there isn't one that looks close to this, but there's the same feel, I think, to the figures in Picasso's blue period, which obviously was later than this, a few years later. Interestingly, Rothenstein's studio was the same studio that Picasso later occupied during his blue period, coincidentally. Later, he was an artist through the world wars. He died in 1945, and he was knighted in 1931, and he painted, this perhaps isn't typical, he painted a lot of well-known portraits in this sort of style. If you look in the National Portrait Gallery for the 1920s and 30s, you'll see a lot by Rothenstein. This is actually a self-portrait. I thought I'd show you what he looked like, but I'm also showing you the style so that you can recognize a Rothenstein when you go around the National Portrait Gallery. He became a teacher, principal at the Royal College of Art, and he was later knighted. How long have I got? 10 minutes. And this painting in the center, I've also spoken about before at length to people, and so I will talk about it, but I'll spend less time on it. Let's start with, surprisingly perhaps, this portrait was one of the most popular portraits the year that it was exhibited, and remained one of the most popular pictures at the beginning of the 20th century, and was engraved. I'm not sure why. It was exhibited, it was painted the year, incidentally, that the Tate Gallery was founded, 1897. And he was certainly an artist, Peacock was an artist that the critics loved from the beginning of his career, but he never sort of stepped up to the expectation that critics had of him. His model is, we know who it is. It's her name is Ethel Brignell, and she was 14 when he painted her. I think pictures of innocent young girls were popular at this time. He married her sister, not Edith, a few years later, and they lived in Wimbledon. He became a well-known artist, exhibited at the Royal Academy, but he didn't, as I said, didn't live up to the expectation the critics had of his future career from his early paintings. He went on, in fact, to make a living from painting elegant ladies in society, not quite in this style, a much harder style, more in the style of Sargent. And he became and made his money as a successful portrait painter. And well, let me move on. Some of you, probably I imagine most of you know this painting. So what in that you've seen it before, by Luke Fildes, called The Doctor. Let me just tell you a story, because I don't think I've mentioned this recently. When I was, on one occasion, I was going around the Tate with a group of art historians, and just us. The Tate was empty at the time, and we stopped in front of this painting, and I was surprised in a way, although in another way not surprised, that the historians, which were, as it happens, were all women, saw this as a representation of power, both the power of the man here, the doctor, but also the hierarchy of society. It's representing the status and power of the professional workers compared with over here, the humble, lowly worker and his wife and their child. But I need to tell you a little bit of background, which, and I can see that in the painting, but if I tell you a little bit of personal background, it may not change your view, but it may balance things differently in your mind. He was commissioned, Luke Fildes, by Sir Henry Tate to, what happened was Henry Tate gave him £3,000 to paint anything he wanted to paint. Luke Fildes was given the decision, the choice to paint whatever he wanted to paint. And he decided to paint a personal tragedy of his own. A few years before, in 1877, his son, his first son, Philip Luke, died at the age of 1 in his Kensington home. And Fildes was inspired by the devotion of the doctor who treated him, Dr. Murray. And Fildes' son, who wrote Fildes' biography, described the character and bearing of the doctor throughout their time of anxiety, and it made a deep impression on my parents. And Dr. Murray became a symbol of professional devotion, which would one day inspire the painting of the doctor. That's from the biography. So it's a personal tragedy that of Fildes that he chose to represent in honor of Dr. Murray. And in fact, although his son died, the reading of this painting by critics at the time is that the child is going to recover. This child here lying, they're so poor that she's lying on 2 chairs and she's been given medicine. This is the medicine over here. It's been mixed in this cup here and given to her. And down here on the floor, I think of the prescriptions for the medicine. And why do I think the child is going to recover? It's because in the Victorian period, the night was seen to be the most critical time. And it was thought that if a child who was ill could survive to the dawn, then they would recover. And we see through the window here, incidentally, this whole set here, this whole room, he recreated in his studio. He had built in his studio. We see the morning light coming in through the window. So it's the first glimmerings of dawn, and so she will survive. Let me, I won't talk about Sickert because I think we might be talking about, yes, I think we're talking about him next week. I'll just end with, because I've got 3 minutes, with an Aubrey Beardsley, because I haven't said much about decadence during this this talk. And this painting by Aubrey Beardsley, and in fact, there's a painting on the reverse, which you can't see. That's why it's called Caprice, and verso on the back, there's a painting of masked woman with a white mouse. But this is Caprice. And I can show you a drawing that he did of the same scene. And it's the only known oil painting that he did, because he's best known as an illustrator, which is why I thought I'd show you his illustration of the same scene. And it's you can see from the illustration, and not to make too fine a point of it, that the representation here in the doorway, this phallic symbol is typical of his illustrations and of this style at the end of the century, but it's not so obvious in the painting. And it's the painting, I think, if you're wondering, is unfinished, and it was typical of the, if you like, the sort of stereotyping that Beardsley used in his representation. We don't know exactly what it represents, but I think it's a scene from a comedy ballet of the marionettes, which is a drawing that was shown in the journal, The Yellow Book. So, whoops, let me just go to the last room. Just to remind you that next week we are going through this door to the next larger room, where we talk about the Edwardian period and the sort of style, the way art was changing in the decade essentially the decade before the First World War started, which we moved to in the following week. So let me stop the talk at that point